The Great Wall of China, a stone dragon stretching for thousands of miles across a rugged, mountainous landscape, is the ultimate symbol of imperial power and monumental effort. It required armies of soldiers to guard it and legions of laborers to build it, a project of such immense scale that it would have bankrupted any lesser state. For millennia, it stood as the physical shield of the empire. But what was its financial shield? How did the Dragon Throne fund this, and the vast armies that patrolled it, often without relying on the unpredictable taxes of its powerful, land-owning nobles? The answer is not found in vast gold mines or chests of silk. It lies in something far more common, something found on every table and in every kitchen, something so essential to life that no one could live without it. It lies in a single humble grain of salt. This is the story of the Salt Hegemony, the greatest and most enduring state monopoly in human history, an audacious system of control that transformed a biological necessity into the financial bedrock of the Chinese Empire, and in doing so, forged the very bureaucracy that would govern it for 2,000 years. At the heart of Chinese imperial history lies a fundamental and enduring paradox. On the one hand, there is the image of the emperor, the son of heaven, who sits upon the dragon throne. He is an autocrat of seemingly absolute power, the holder of the mandate of heaven, the central axis around which the entire civilized world revolves. His edicts are law, his armies are vast, and his authority is, in theory, total. But on the other hand, there is the precarious reality of that power. For 2 millennia, every dynasty, from the mighty Han to the brilliant Tang and beyond, was locked in a constant, simmering war, not just with the nomads on its frontiers, but with the powerful, entrenched aristocracy within its own borders. These were the great landowning families, the regional nobles and gentry whose power was rooted in the soil. They controlled the vast agricultural heartlands, and therefore, they controlled the state's primary source of revenue, the grain tax. This gave them immense leverage. They could underreport harvests, resist tax collectors, and use their local influence to challenge the authority of the central government. For the emperor, this was an existential threat. How could he fund a national army, build a great wall, or administer a continent-sized empire if his income depended on the fickle loyalty of the very men who were his greatest internal rivals? To secure the throne and forge a truly centralized state, the emperor needed a new source of power, a stream of revenue that flowed directly into his treasury, a tax that the landed nobles could not intercept, manipulate, or control. The search for this financial holy grail would lead the strategists of the imperial court to a brilliant, ruthless, and revolutionary solution. The answer was not a tax on land, which the nobles dominated, nor a tax on trade, which could be inconsistent. The answer was to seize control of a commodity so fundamental, so non-negotiable, and so universally required that it amounted to a tax on life itself. That commodity was salt. To the modern mind, it is a simple seasoning. But in the ancient world, salt was a strategic resource of the highest order. It was a biological necessity. Every single person in the empire, from the poorest rice farmer to the wealthiest court official, required salt in their diet to survive. There was no substitute. The demand was absolute and perfectly inelastic. Furthermore, its production was not diffuse like agriculture. Salt could only be harvested in specific, geographically concentrated locations. From the vast salt flats on the seacoast, from the brine lakes of the interior, and from deep, mysterious salt wells. This made it a monopolist's dream. An emperor who could seize and control these limited points of production could control the entire empire's supply. This documentary will argue that the creation of the imperial salt monopoly was the single most important political and economic innovation in Chinese history. We will trace the journey of this humble mineral from the state-run salt pans where it was harvested under the watchful eye of imperial officials, through the complex distribution network, and finally to the table of every family in China. We will show how the immense salt dividend provided the Dragon Throne with a financial superpower, an independent revenue stream that funded its grandest ambitions. But most importantly, we will argue that the true genius of the Salt Hegemony was not the money it generated, but the system it required. To manage this vast, nationwide enterprise, the state had to create something new, A massive, professional, and centrally controlled bureaucracy, an army of scholar officials who owed their loyalty not to a local lord, but to the imperial system itself. This is the story of how the quest to control a single grain of salt forged the very administrative structure that would define and sustain the Chinese Empire for 2,000 years. To understand the power of the salt hegemony, to grasp how a substance as mundane as table salt could become the financial bedrock of one of the world's most enduring empires, we must first strip away the lens of modernity. We must forget the iodized cylinders in our kitchen cabinets, the salt shakers on our tables, the casual abundance that has rendered this once precious mineral almost invisible. We must journey back to a world governed by a set of hard, non-negotiable truths, a world without refrigeration, without global supply chains, and without the chemical conveniences of the industrial age. In that world, salt was not a seasoning. It was a strategic resource of the highest order, a substance whose importance was comparable to that of water, grain, and iron. Its power was derived from a simple, inescapable fact: the absolute biological necessity of salt for human life, and its indispensable role in preserving the food that sustained civilizations. The first pillar of salt's power is written into our very DNA. Every human being is, in essence, a walking ocean. The saline solution that constitutes our blood, our sweat, and our tears is a remnant of our primordial origins, a chemical echo of the seas where life began. This internal ocean is not a passive medium. It is the very conductor of life's electrical signals. Sodium chloride, salt, is the critical electrolyte that facilitates the transmission of nerve impulses, allowing our brains to communicate with our bodies. It is the chemical key that enables the contraction and relaxation of our muscles, from the blinking of an eye to the beating of our hearts. It regulates the fluid balance in and around our cells, governing blood pressure and ensuring the proper function of every organ system. Without a steady, reliable intake of salt, this intricate biological machinery begins to fail. The first signs are subtle: fatigue, dizziness, muscle cramps. But a chronic deficiency leads to a catastrophic breakdown, culminating in convulsions, coma, and, inevitably, death. The human body cannot produce its own salt. It must be consumed. This simple, biological imperative is the ultimate foundation of salt's power. The demand for it is not a matter of taste or preference. It is a matter of life and death. For early, nomadic hunter-gatherer societies, this was rarely a problem. Their diet, rich in the meat and blood of the animals they hunted, provided a sufficient and naturally occurring supply of salt. But the Great Neolithic Revolution, the shift to agriculture that made civilization possible, created a profound and dangerous dietary imbalance. A diet based on cultivated cereals on rice in the south of China, on millet and wheat in the north, is dangerously poor in natural salt. As China's population grew and became increasingly dependent on agriculture, a massive, society-wide salt hunger was created. The state that could reliably satisfy this fundamental, biological craving held a powerful lever of control over its population. To control the salt supply was to hold the key to the very physiological well-being of every subject in the realm. This biological necessity was amplified 1,000-fold by the second, and arguably more significant, pillar of salt's power: its role in food preservation. We live in a world of artificial cold, a world where the bounty of the summer harvest can be frozen and enjoyed in the depths of winter. The pre-modern world had no such luxury. It was a world governed by the brutal tyranny of the seasons. The harvest was a time of temporary abundance, a frantic race to gather in the grain before it rotted in the field. But this abundance was fleeting. In the long, lean months of winter, or during the unpredictable droughts and floods that could wipe out a year's crop, famine was a constant and terrifying threat. The ability to preserve food, to store the surplus of the good times against the scarcity of the bad, was the single most important challenge for any large, settled agrarian society. It was the absolute prerequisite for food security, and the key to that security was salt. The science behind it is simple but profound. The microorganisms that cause decay, the bacteria, yeasts, and molds require water to live and multiply. Salt is a powerful desiccant, a mineral with an intense thirst for water. When a piece of meat, a fish, or a vegetable is packed in salt or submerged in a brine solution, a powerful process of osmosis begins. The salt draws the water out of the food itself, and, just as importantly, it sucks the water out of the cells of any invading microorganisms, killing them or rendering them dormant. Salting was the chemical key that unlocked the future. It was a technology that allowed a community to break free from the immediate, hand-to-mouth cycle of production and consumption. A glut of fish caught in the spring could be salted and dried, providing a vital source of protein in the autumn. The meat of a pig slaughtered in the fall could be cured into hams and bacon that would last through the winter. Cabbages and other vegetables could be pickled in brine, ensuring a supply of essential vitamins when the fields were barren. For the Chinese imperial state, the implications of this technology were monumental. On the most basic level, it was the key to feeding its immense population and preventing the famines that could lead to peasant rebellions and the collapse of dynasties. By controlling the salt, the state controlled the primary means of food preservation, making every farmer in the empire indirectly dependent on the government for their family's long-term survival. But the strategic importance went far beyond domestic food security. Salt was the indispensable fuel of the imperial military machine. An army, particularly a large army deployed for long campaigns on the northern frontiers, could not live off the land. Foraging was too slow, too unreliable, and impossible in the barren lands where many of the great campaigns against the nomadic Xiongnu were fought. An army needed a supply train, and that supply train needed to carry preserved rations. The soldiers who patrolled the Great Wall, the armies that pushed deep into the steppes, and the garrisons that held the remote outposts of the empire were all fed on a diet of salted meat, salted fish, and pickled vegetables. Without a massive, state-controlled supply of salt, the projection of military power over the vast distances of the Chinese empire would have been a logistical impossibility. The biological imperative for salt in the human body, combined with the civilizational imperative for it in food preservation and the geographical reality of its limited sources, created a perfect storm of opportunity. It was a power that the great, ambitious strategists of the Han Dynasty would be the first to fully and ruthlessly harness. They would take control of this simple, essential grain and forge it into the financial and administrative backbone of an empire. The idea of state control over salt was not born in a vacuum. For centuries, various Chinese states had experimented with different forms of taxation and regulation on this vital commodity, recognizing its immense potential as a source of revenue. But these early attempts were often localized, inefficient, or short-lived. It would take a ruler of immense ambition, faced with an existential crisis of unprecedented scale, to transform this patchwork of local taxes into a coherent, empire-wide, and ruthlessly efficient state monopoly. That ruler was Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, one of the most consequential and formidable figures in all of Chinese history. In the year 117 BCE, driven by the ruinous costs of a generation-long war, Emperor Wu and his legalist-minded chancellor, Sang Hongyang, made a decision that would alter the trajectory of the Chinese state forever. They issued an edict that nationalized the salt and iron industries, placing the two most essential commodities in the empire under the absolute and exclusive control of the Dragon Throne. This was not a simple tax increase. It was a fiscal revolution, a declaration of war against the private merchants who had grown rich from these trades, and, more subtly, against the landed nobility who stood as the emperor's greatest rivals. The Han Dynasty, at the height of its power in the 2nd century BCE, was a victim of its own success. It had consolidated the empire after the chaos of the Warring States period, establishing a vast and prosperous realm. But its very existence was defined by a single, all-consuming military threat, the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were a powerful confederation of nomadic tribes on the northern steppe, brilliant horsemen and archers who raided the settled agricultural lands of China with devastating impunity. For decades, the early Han emperors had pursued a policy of appeasement, the Heqin policy, which involved sending lavish gifts of silk, grain, and even imperial princesses as brides to the Xiongnu chieftains in a desperate attempt to buy peace. This policy was not only humiliating, but also ruinously expensive. It was a constant drain on the imperial treasury, a form of imperial blackmail that never truly stopped the raids. When the young, energetic Emperor Wu ascended to the throne in 141 BCE, He was determined to end this policy of appeasement and break the Xiongnu threat once and for all. He reversed the Heqin policy and launched a series of massive, audacious military campaigns, sending armies of over 100,000 men deep into the heart of the steppe. These campaigns were, over the long term, strategically successful. They pushed the Xiongnu back from the frontiers, secured the vital Gansu corridor, and laid the groundwork for the establishment of the Silk Road. But their immediate cost was catastrophic. The expense of equipping, feeding, and paying such enormous armies, deployed for years at a time hundreds of miles from their supply bases, pushed the Han state to the brink of bankruptcy. The traditional source of state revenue, the land tax, was simply insufficient. It was also politically difficult to raise, as any increase would have to be approved by the very landowning nobles who dominated the court and who would have to pay it. The emperor was caught in a fiscal trap. His grand military ambitions required a river of cash, but the well of his traditional income was running dry. It was in this moment of crisis that the emperor's brilliant and controversial chancellor, Sang Hongyang, proposed his radical solution. Sang was a product of the legalist school of thought, a political philosophy that was the polar opposite of the dominant Confucian ideal. While the Confucians preached of a government based on morality, tradition, and the benevolent example of the ruler, the legalists were hard-headed pragmatists. They believed in the power of the state, the importance of clear and strict laws, and the necessity of centralizing power in the hands of the sovereign. They argued that the state should not shy away from engaging in commerce and industry if it served the national interest. For Sang Hongyang, the great salt and iron merchants of the empire were a problem. They had grown fantastically wealthy by controlling essential resources, their power sometimes rivaling that of the state itself. He saw their private wealth as a wasted resource, a stream of potential revenue that was flowing into private pockets instead of the imperial treasury. His solution was audacious. The state should become the merchant. The plan was a masterstroke of economic warfare. The Edict of 117 BCE abolished all private production and trade in salt and iron. The great coastal salt pans and the deep brine wells of the interior were seized by the state and placed under the management of a new government agency. The iron foundries met the same fate. From this point forward, any private individual caught producing salt or iron would be brutally punished, their left toe amputated, and their equipment confiscated. The state was now the sole legal producer. It would then sell these essential commodities back to the people, but at a significant markup. This was not a direct tax, which the people would have resented, but a hidden one, embedded in the price of a product that every single person had to buy. It was a universal, unavoidable, and perfectly efficient system for extracting revenue from the entire population, bypassing the landed nobility completely. This radical policy did not go unchallenged. It sparked one of the most famous and important debates in Chinese intellectual history, a confrontation that pitted the two great philosophies of the age against each other. Decades later, in 81 BCE, a group of Confucian scholars from the provinces came to the capital to argue for the repeal of the monopolies. Their arguments, recorded in the text, known as the Discourses on Salt and Iron, were primarily moral. They argued that it was beneath the dignity of the emperor, the benevolent father of his people, to engage in haggling with the common people for profit. They claimed the state-run industries were inefficient and produced poor quality goods. They warned that the pursuit of profit would corrupt the government, and that the state's proper role was to govern through moral example, not through commercial coercion. The monopolies, they argued, were an affront to the natural order and an oppression of the people. Sang Hongyang, now an old man but still a formidable debater, met their arguments with a fusillade of pragmatic realism. He scoffed at their idealistic pronouncements. He laid out the brutal reality of the state's finances and the ever-present threat of the Xiongnu on the frontier. The monopolies, he argued, were not about enriching the emperor, they were about securing the nation. Without this revenue, he thundered, how can we fund the armies that protect you from being enslaved by the barbarians? How can we pay for the garrisons that guard the Great Wall while you sit here and talk of benevolence? He argued that the monopolies were a way of taxing the strong and the idle, the merchants to the benefit of the whole, and that by controlling these essential industries, the state could stabilize prices and prevent the kind of hoarding and speculation that had caused so much misery in the past. It was a clash between idealism and realism, between moral philosophy and political economy. In the end, Zhang Hongyang's arguments carried the day. The monopolies, with their undeniable success in filling the state's coffers, were simply too valuable to abolish. The edict of Emperor Wu stood, and the Salt Hegemony was born. It was a system forged in a moment of existential crisis, a legalist solution to an imperial problem, and it would become the enduring financial and administrative template for every great dynasty to follow. The imperial edict that nationalized the salt industry was a document of breathtaking ambition. It was one thing to declare a monopoly in the grandeur of the capital. It was another, far more complex, to enforce it across a territory of continental scale. To transform the salt hegemony from a bold idea into a functioning reality, the Han state had to create something new, a vast, sprawling, and powerful bureaucratic machine dedicated to the single purpose of controlling every grain of salt from its production to its final sale. This was the origin of the Salt Commission, or Salt Gabelle, an institution that would become one of the most enduring and important pillars of the Chinese imperial state. The story of this commission is the story of how a fiscal policy gave birth to a bureaucracy, an army of officials, clerks, inspectors, and guards who owed their loyalty not to a local lord, but to the central government and the regulations it administered. This was the machinery of control, a complex system of production, distribution, and enforcement that represented a new and formidable level of state penetration into the daily lives of its subjects. The first task of the new administration was to take control of the means of production. Salt in China was not a single, monolithic industry. It was a diverse and geographically scattered enterprise, and the Salt Commission had to develop different techniques to master each type. The most productive and important source was the sea. Along the vast, muddy coastlines of Shandong and Jiangsu, the state established immense salt fields, or yanchang. These were marvels of hydraulic engineering, sprawling complexes of evaporation pans, dikes, and reservoirs connected by a web of canals. The process was laborious and seasonal. Seawater would be let into a series of shallow, clay-lined basins. Over the long, hot months of summer, the sun would evaporate the water, leaving behind a thick, saline slurry. This brine would then be moved to smaller pans and boiled in huge iron cauldrons, a process that required vast quantities of fuel in the form of firewood or coal, until the final, white crystals of salt precipitated out. The state did not just own these facilities, it directly managed them. The workers, or yanding, were often a hereditary class of state employees, a permanent workforce bound to the salt fields, their lives dictated by the rhythm of the tides and the demands of the imperial quotas. In the rugged, mountainous interior of Sichuan, a different and even more remarkable industry had developed. Here, far from the sea, the salt came from deep underground, from ancient brine deposits trapped thousands of feet below the surface. The salt producers of Sichuan were the pioneers of deep drill drilling, centuries, if not millennia, before similar technology appeared in the West. Using heavy iron bits attached to long bamboo cables, and powered by teams of men jumping on and off a seesaw-like lever, they would patiently pound their way into the earth. The process was incredibly slow, a well sometimes taking years to complete. When they finally pierced a brine deposit, the salt water would rush to the surface under its own pressure. This brine was then piped through an intricate network of bamboo pipelines, an astonishing feat of engineering in itself, to collection points where it would be boiled, often using the natural gas that was also tapped by their deep wells. Under the monopoly, the state took control of these brine wells, either operating them directly or, more commonly, licensing private producers and then buying their entire output at a fixed, non-negotiable price. The third source was rock salt, mined from the earth like any other mineral, and the salt lakes of the interior, particularly the Great Salt Lake at Yunqing in Shaanxi. Here, the process was simpler. The salt-crusted earth could be scraped up, or the lake water could be channeled into evaporation pans. In all cases, the principle of the monopoly was the same. The state, through its designated officials, asserted absolute and total control over the point of production. Imperial guards were stationed at the salt fields, the brine wells, and the salt lakes to prevent any unauthorized production or theft. Every grain of salt legally produced in the empire now belonged to the emperor. Once the salt was produced and consolidated in government storehouses, the second great challenge began: distribution. This was a logistical nightmare of continental scale. The salt produced on the coast had to be transported hundreds, even thousands of miles inland to the provinces that had no local supply. The commission had to become a master of logistics, commanding a vast infrastructure of barges to move the salt along the empire's great rivers and canals, and a fleet of carts to haul it overland. They created a network of regional depots and sub-depots, a hierarchical system designed to ensure a steady supply to every corner of the realm. This required a level of planning and coordination that was unprecedented. Officials had to calculate the annual demand for each province, arrange for the transport, and factor in the costs and the inevitable losses along the way. It was at the point of sale that the state's profit was finally realized. The system varied over the centuries, but the basic models were established early on. Under the simplest model, the state itself acted as the retailer. It would set up official, licensed salt shops where people could buy their legal ration of salt at a fixed, high price. A more sophisticated and common method was the certificate system. The state would sell salt certificates, or yanian, to a class of licensed private merchants. This certificate gave the merchant the right to travel to a designated state depot, collect a specified quantity of salt, and then transport and sell it themselves within a designated sales area. The price of the certificate, paid up front to the government, was where the state made its primary profit. This system had the advantage of privatizing the immense cost and risk of the final stages of distribution, while still keeping the wholesale price and the overall supply firmly in the hands of the government. The final, and perhaps most difficult, task of the Salt Commission was enforcement. The immense profits generated by the monopoly created an equally immense incentive for black market activity. The world of salt smuggling was a constant, festering sore on the body of the empire. This shadow economy ranged from small-scale local smuggling, a peasant living near the coast secretly boiling a pot of seawater for his family, to vast, highly organized criminal syndicates. These salt gangs would operate their own illegal salt fields in remote, hidden locations, or they would hijack government salt convoys. They had their own armies of armed guards, their own distribution networks, and their own black markets where they would sell their tax-free salt at a lower price than the official government product. For the state, this was not just an economic threat, it was a political one. These smugglers were, in essence, private tax collectors, diverting a stream of revenue that belonged to the emperor into their own pockets. To combat this, the Salt Commission had to become a national police force. It employed a vast army of inspectors and armed patrolmen. Checkpoints were established on rivers, canals, and major roads to inspect cargo and verify that any merchant carrying salt had the proper government certificates. The punishments for smuggling were draconian. Smugglers could be beaten, branded, exiled, or even executed. The state waged a perpetual, low-level war against the salt gangs, a violent, bloody conflict that would flare up and die down for centuries. The very existence of this vast enforcement apparatus is a testament to the monopoly's success. The state was willing to expend enormous resources to protect its golden goose, and in doing so, it extended its police power into the daily lives of its subjects in a way that no simple land tax ever could. The Salt Commission was, therefore, far more than a tax agency. It was a nationalized industry, a logistical network, a wholesale business, and a paramilitary police force all rolled into one. It was the indispensable, and often brutal, machinery that turned a simple grain of salt into the financial foundation of the empire. The vast and complex machinery of the Salt Commission was not an end in itself. It was an engine, and the fuel it produced was the lifeblood of the imperial state, a massive, predictable, and independent stream of revenue. This was the salt dividend, a torrent of cash that flowed directly into the emperor's treasury, fundamentally reshaping the balance of power within the Chinese empire. While the land tax was the traditional, foundational income of the state, it was a problematic and contested resource, its collection mediated and often manipulated by the powerful landed gentry. The salt revenue was different. It was a direct commercial income stream that bypassed this entrenched aristocracy entirely. This financial superpower gave the Dragon Throne a level of autonomy and a capacity for action that was unprecedented. It was the salt dividend that funded the empire's greatest ambitions, paying for the vast armies that patrolled its frontiers, the monumental construction projects that glorified its rulers, and the sprawling bureaucracy that administered its will. The control of salt was not just a fiscal policy. It was the ultimate tool of centralization. The sheer scale of the salt revenue is difficult to overstate. In periods of strong central control, such as the mid-Tang dynasty, the income from the salt monopoly could account for over half of the entire state's annual revenue. Even in other dynasties, it regularly constituted a massive portion, often 20 to 30% of the government's cash income. This was a game-changing sum of money. Unlike the land tax, which was often paid in grain and was subject to the fluctuations of the harvest, the salt revenue was collected in hard currency, in bronze coins or silver bullion. This gave the central government an immense pool of liquid capital, a ready war chest that could be deployed quickly and decisively for imperial projects. An emperor no longer had to go, hat in hand, to his powerful nobles to request a special levy to fund a new military campaign. He now had his own independent source of funding. He could pay his own bills. The most critical and consistent expense for every Chinese dynasty was the military. The defense of the northern frontier against the constant threat of nomadic peoples, from the Xiongnu of the Han to the Mongols of the Ming, was an endless, ruinously expensive undertaking. The Great Wall was not a static defense. It was a militarized zone that required hundreds of thousands of soldiers to garrison its forts, patrol its length, and launch offensive campaigns into the steppe. These soldiers had to be paid, fed, and equipped. The salt dividend was, first and foremost, the payroll for this immense standing army. The preserved rations of salted meat and fish that sustained these soldiers were a product of the salt industry, and the cash that paid their wages was the direct profit from its sale. Without the predictable, massive income from the salt monopoly, the sustained projection of Chinese military power, and the defense of the Great Wall over 2 millennia would have been a financial impossibility. The salt revenue was the secret shield that stood behind the stone one. Beyond defense, the salt dividend was the fuel for the empire's grandest and most audacious construction projects. These were not just practical pieces of infrastructure. They were monumental statements of imperial power and legitimacy, designed to unify the realm and glorify the reigning dynasty. The greatest of these, a project that rivaled the Great Wall in its scale and importance, was the Grand Canal. This astonishing feat of engineering, first begun in earlier dynasties but massively expanded and consolidated under the Sui and Tang, was a man-made river that stretched for over 1,000 miles, linking the rice-rich agricultural heartlands of the Yangtze River in the south with the political and military centers of the Yellow River Valley in the north. It was the great artery of the empire, allowing for the transport of tax grain, military supplies, and commercial goods on a scale that was unimaginable anywhere else in the world. But its construction was a colossal undertaking, requiring the labor of millions and a staggering expenditure of state funds. It was the reliable, centralized revenue from the salt and other commercial monopolies that provided the cash needed to pay the engineers, feed the laborers, and complete this nation-building project. This pattern was repeated throughout the dynasties. When the Yongle emperor of the Ming dynasty decided to move the capital to Beijing and construct the magnificent Forbidden City in the early 15th century, it was a project of almost unbelievable expense. The vast quantities of precious timber, the millions of specially made bricks, the acres of glazed tile, and the wages of the hundreds of thousands of artisans and laborers who toiled for decades to build this new imperial center were paid for, in large part, by the profits of the state's commercial monopolies, with salt chief among them. The salt dividend gave emperors the power to literally reshape the geography of their realm and to build their authority in timber and stone. However, the most profound and lasting impact of the salt dividend was not military or architectural, but political. It fundamentally and permanently altered the relationship between the emperor and the aristocracy. The traditional landed nobility, the great families who had dominated Chinese society for centuries, derived their power from their vast, semi-independent estates. They were the gatekeepers of the land tax, the essential intermediaries upon whom the emperor had to rely. The salt monopoly broke this dependency. The emperor now had a power base that was entirely his own, a financial and administrative structure that was staffed by men who were his direct employees, not his semi-independent feudal vassals. The Salt Commission, the bureaucracy that managed the monopoly, became a parallel power structure, a direct extension of the emperor's will that reached into every province and every county. This new class of salaried, professional administrators, who owed their careers and their loyalty to the central government, became the emperor's most powerful weapon against the forces of feudal fragmentation. He could use them to monitor the activities of the local nobles, to enforce imperial edicts, and to ensure that the will of the capital was felt in the furthest corners of the realm. The salt revenue allowed the emperor to create and sustain a bureaucracy that was loyal to the institution of the state, not to the landed interests of a particular region. This was the key to China's remarkable and unique political trajectory. While Europe, after the fall of Rome, fractured into 1,000 competing feudal fiefdoms, China was able to consistently re-establish a centralized, bureaucratic empire. The Salt Hegemony was at the very heart of this success. It was the financial and administrative tool that allowed the central government to win its long, slow war against the centrifugal forces of feudalism. It was the dividend that paid not just for walls and canals, but for the very existence of a unified, bureaucratic state. The Salt Hegemony was a system of immense power and profitability, but its very success created a dark and violent shadow. For every imperial official who managed the monopoly, for every licensed merchant who profited from it, there was a man in the shadows who sought to defy it. The state's decision to declare salt a nationalized commodity, to inflate its price, and to ruthlessly punish any who interfered, did not eliminate the private salt trade. It simply drove it underground and transformed it into a vast, sophisticated, and often brutally violent black market. This was the world of the salt privateers, the smugglers, the gang bosses, and the bandit kings who operated in the grey zones of the empire, beyond the reach of the magistrate's brush. The struggle between the Imperial Salt Commission and this shadow economy was a perpetual, bloody, and undeclared civil war that raged for 2,000 years. At times, the leaders of this illicit world grew so powerful that they could challenge the Dragon Throne itself, transforming their commercial empires into rebel armies that threatened to wash away the very foundations of the state. The incentive for salt smuggling was simple and overwhelming: profit. The state monopoly functioned by buying salt from producers at a low, fixed price, or producing it cheaply itself, and then selling it to the people at a price that was many times higher. The difference, the gabelle, was pure state profit. This immense, artificially created price gap was a powerful invitation to any entrepreneur with a high tolerance for risk. A smuggler who could produce his own salt from a hidden coastal marsh, or who could hijack a government salt convoy, could sell his product on the black market for a price that was significantly lower than the official government price, but still represented a massive profit margin for himself. To the common people, particularly the desperately poor, the choice was clear. The official government salt was the legal salt, guanyan, but the smuggler's product was the private salt, ziyan, and it was always cheaper. Loyalty to the emperor was an abstract concept, but the daily struggle to feed one's family was a harsh reality. The black market, therefore, had a vast and willing customer base. The world of salt smuggling operated on every scale. At the lowest level, it was a crime of poverty and opportunity. A family living near a salt pan might sneak out at night to scrape up a few pounds of salt for their own use or to trade with their neighbors. A low-level official at a government depot could be bribed to look the other way as a few extra sacks were loaded onto a merchant's cart. But the real power of the shadow economy lay in the highly organized, professional syndicates that emerged to challenge the state on a massive scale. These were the salt gangs, criminal enterprises that were the mirror image of the official Salt Commission. They had their own illegal production facilities, secret salt fields hidden in remote coastal swamps, camouflaged and protected by the local landscape. They had their own logistics, fleets of fast boats for moving the illicit salt by river and sea, and networks of sympathetic villagers and corrupt officials who would hide and transport their goods on land. Most importantly, they had their own armies. To protect their valuable product from seizure by government patrols and from hijacking by rival gangs, the great salt smugglers had to become warlords. They recruited and armed legions of desperate and hardened men, demobilized soldiers, impoverished peasants, and outlaws to serve as their private enforcers. The leaders of these gangs were often figures of immense charisma and ruthless efficiency, men who commanded a level of loyalty from their followers that rivaled that of any imperial magistrate. They were the godfathers of their age, men who ran a vast and violent business empire in direct defiance of the state. The waterways of the great river systems, like the Huai and the Yangtze, became the battlegrounds for this perpetual war. The Salt Gang's armed flotillas would clash in bloody naval battles with the patrol boats of the Salt Commission, a constant, violent struggle for control of the arteries of commerce. At several key moments in Chinese history, the power of these smuggler kings grew so immense that they were able to pivot from simple criminality to open rebellion, threatening the very survival of the reigning dynasty. The most spectacular example of this came during the decline of the Great Tang Dynasty. In the late 9th century, a man named Huang Chao rose to prominence. He was not a disgruntled general or a rival prince. He was a salt smuggler. Having failed the prestigious civil service exams, he had turned to the illicit salt trade, and through his intelligence and ruthlessness, had become the leader of a powerful smuggling syndicate in the region between the Yellow and Huai rivers. As the Tang state weakened from internal decay and a series of devastating famines, popular anger against the oppressive government, and particularly against the high price of legal salt, reached a boiling point. Huang Chao, the salt smuggler, transformed himself into Huang Chao, the rebel king. He used his immense illicit wealth to absorb smaller bandit groups and to arm a massive peasant army. His background as a smuggler had given him all the skills of a great military commander. He was a master of logistics. He knew how to move large bodies of men over vast distances, and he commanded a fanatical loyalty from his followers. In 875, he launched a rebellion that would set the entire empire ablaze. His army swept across China, capturing major cities and, in 881, even succeeding in sacking the magnificent Tang capital, Chang'an, forcing the emperor to flee in humiliation. Huang Chao briefly declared himself the emperor of a new dynasty. Although his rebellion was eventually crushed, it had shattered the authority of the Tang, from which the dynasty would never recover. The story of Huang Chao was a terrifying lesson for every emperor who followed. The shadow economy of salt was not just a leak in the treasury. It was a potential existential threat, a breeding ground for rebels who possessed the wealth, the organization, and the military force to challenge the mandate of heaven. The state, therefore, could never afford to be complacent. The perpetual war against the smugglers shaped the very nature of the Salt Commission, forcing it to become an ever more militarized and sophisticated police force. But the state also learned to be pragmatic. At times, the government would try to co-opt the very smugglers it was fighting. A policy of recruiting the strong would be implemented, where powerful smuggler bosses would be offered an official pardon and a lucrative position within the Salt Commission in exchange for bringing their private armies and their expert knowledge of the black market over to the government's side. This was a classic imperial strategy of turning poachers into gamekeepers, a recognition that the men who ran the shadow economy were often the most talented and entrepreneurial individuals in their generation. The very existence of this policy is the ultimate testament to the smuggler's power. The Salt Hegemony was a constant, dynamic struggle. The state created the monopoly created the smuggler, and the smuggler, in turn, forced the state to become ever more powerful and pervasive to contain the threat he represented. The Salt Hegemony was a machine that ran on men, to manage an enterprise of such staggering scale and complexity, to oversee the production at 100 scattered sites, to calculate the logistics of continental distribution, to enforce the regulations, and, above all, to collect and audit the immense revenues. The concept of selecting officials based on merit rather than birth was not a new one, with early forms dating back to the Han Dynasty. But it was in the centuries following the establishment of the great state monopolies that the system truly came into its own, evolving from a limited imperial recruitment tool into the central nervous system of the entire state. The logic was inescapable. An institution as powerful, profitable, and geographically dispersed as the Salt Commission could not be entrusted to the emperor's cousins, or to the sons of powerful dukes. To place a hereditary noble in charge of the salt revenues in a distant province was to invite embezzlement and rebellion. His local power base would give him the means and the motive to divert the state's income into his own coffers. The emperor needed officials who were his men of the brush, whose authority derived not from the sword or the ownership of land, but from their position within the imperial bureaucracy itself. The civil service examinations were the brilliant, systemic solution to this problem. It was a grueling, multi-stage process, designed to identify the brightest scholarly minds in the empire. Young men from almost any social class, with the exception of certain mean professions, could, in theory, participate. They dedicated years of their lives to the single-minded memorization and study of the Confucian classics, a vast and complex body of literature, history, and philosophy. The examinations were a series of brutal, anonymous, and fiercely competitive tests. Candidates would be locked in small, individual cells for days at a time, writing complex essays and policy proposals based on classical precedents. The system was designed to test not just knowledge, but endurance, calligraphy, and a deep internalization of the Confucian worldview of a hierarchical, ordered, and harmonious society. Those who succeeded, who passed through the prefectural, provincial, and finally the metropolitan examinations in the capital, became part of the most elite and respected class in all of China. The scholar officials, the Mandarins. What was the prize for these successful candidates? It was a government job. And for much of Chinese history, the most powerful, lucrative, and sought-after jobs were not in the imperial court in the capital, but in the great commercial and fiscal agencies of the state, chief among them, the Salt Commission. A posting as a salt commissioner in a key production and distribution hub like the city of Yangzhou was a path to immense power and personal wealth. The commissioner in such a region was not just a tax collector, he was the CEO of a massive state-owned enterprise. He controlled a budget of staggering size, he commanded an army of clerks, guards, and inspectors, and he held the economic fate of millions of people in his hands. The potential for both official profit, through bonuses and promotions, and unofficial gain, through kickbacks and corruption, was almost limitless. This made the Salt Commission a powerful engine, driving the ambitions of every aspiring scholar in the empire. A young man from a modest, landless family, studying the classics by candlelight in a remote province, was not just dreaming of becoming a poet or a philosopher. He was dreaming of the day he would pass the exams and win a posting as a salt official, a position that would bring wealth and glory to himself, his family, and his entire clan. This powerful incentive, the lure of a career in the state's most profitable enterprise, fueled the entire educational system. It encouraged families to invest in the education of their brightest sons, and it created a nationwide culture that prized scholarship and literacy as the primary path to social mobility. The Salt Commission, by its very existence, created the demand for the very type of educated, bureaucratically minded man that the examination system was designed to produce. The two institutions were locked in a perfect symbiotic embrace. This relationship had a profound and lasting impact on the character of the Chinese state. It created a ruling class that was, in theory, both highly educated and deeply loyal to the system that had created it. A scholar official who had spent 20 years of his life mastering the Confucian classics and passing the exams owed his entire career not to a local lord or a family name, but to the emperor and the bureaucratic system he now served. His power was transferable. He could be posted as a salt inspector in Sichuan 1 year and a magistrate in a northern province the next. His loyalty was to the centrally administered, empire-wide system, not to a specific place or a feudal dynasty. This created a class of men who saw the empire as a single, coherent entity, and who saw themselves as the professional managers of that entity. The Salt Commission was the perfect training ground and the ultimate expression of this new class. To be a successful salt official required a specific and very modern set of skills. It required a mastery of accounting and auditing to track the revenues. It required a deep understanding of logistics and supply chain management to oversee the distribution. It required a knowledge of engineering to manage the salt pans and wells. And it required a ruthless administrative ability to police the smugglers and enforce the state's regulations. The men who rose through the ranks of the Salt Commission were some of the most talented and pragmatic administrators in the world. They were the hardened, practical core of the Chinese bureaucracy, the men who truly understood how the empire worked and how it was paid for. Their very existence was a constant check on the power of both the hereditary aristocracy and the great military generals. The Mandarins, forged in the crucible of the examination system and funded by the profits of the salt monopoly, were the true, enduring rulers of imperial China. The hegemony of salt was not just about money. It was about the creation of the men who would run the empire. Dynasties rise and fall with the rhythm of a natural disaster. Great emperors are followed by weak ones. Periods of peace and prosperity give way to rebellion, fragmentation, and foreign invasion. In the long, tumultuous sweep of Chinese history, few institutions have been able to withstand this relentless cycle of creation and destruction. Armies are defeated, palaces are burned, and entire ruling families are extinguished. Yet, through it all, one institution, one fundamental pillar of state power, endured with a resilience that bordered on the eternal. This was the Salt Hegemony. The salt monopoly, first formalized by the Han Dynasty in 117 BCE, was not the fleeting policy of a single ambitious emperor. It was a masterpiece of political and economic statecraft that was so effective, so powerful, and so essential that it would be adopted, adapted, and refined by every major dynasty to rule China for the next 2,000 years. The story of the Salt Gabelle's longevity is the story of the core DNA of the Chinese imperial state, a testament to a system of power that could survive even the most catastrophic of changes. When the great Han Dynasty finally collapsed in the 3rd century CE, China entered a long and chaotic period of disunion, a time of fragmentation and civil war that lasted for nearly 400 years. The centralized state fractured and regional warlords carved out their own kingdoms. Yet, the principle of the salt monopoly did not vanish. The various competing kingdoms, each desperately in need of revenue to fund their armies, almost universally maintained their own, smaller-scale versions of the Salt Gabelle. The memory of its immense profitability was too powerful to forget. When China was finally reunified under the brilliant and ruthless Sui dynasty in the late 6th century, and then more permanently under the glorious Tang dynasty that followed, the restoration of the imperial salt monopoly was a top priority. It was seen as an essential tool for consolidating central power and for funding the immense projects of a reunified empire. It was under the Tang that the Salt Commission was refined into a truly formidable and sophisticated instrument of state power. The catalyst, once again, was a moment of existential crisis. The devastating An Lushan rebellion in the mid-8th century shattered the early Tang's prosperity and nearly destroyed the state. The central government lost control of many of its provinces, and its traditional revenue from the land tax plummeted. In this desperate situation, the Tang court turned to a brilliant group of financial reformers who saw that a revitalized salt monopoly was the key to the dynasty's survival. They created a new, powerful, and independent Salt Commission, placing it under the control of some of the most capable administrators in the empire. They streamlined the system, cracking down on smugglers, and, most importantly, they transformed it into an even more efficient engine of revenue. Under the reformed Tang Gabelle, the price of salt was massively inflated, and the profits that flowed into the depleted imperial treasury were so immense that they almost single-handedly paid for the enormous military expenditures needed to crush the rebellion and stabilize the empire. It was a stunning demonstration of the monopoly's power, proving that it was not just a tool for prosperity, but a lifeline in times of crisis. The dynasties that followed, the Song, the Yuan, the Ming, and the Qing, each put their own unique stamp on the administration of the Salt Hegemony, but none ever dared to abolish it. The Song dynasty, famous for its commercial revolution and burgeoning market economy, experimented with a more privatized version of the system. They created a complex market in salt certificates, or yuanian, which became a form of speculative paper currency in their own right. Merchants would buy these certificates from the government, providing the state with its essential upfront revenue, and then trade them among themselves before finally redeeming them for salt at the production depots. This created a dynamic and often volatile market, but it kept the core principle of state control intact. When the Mongols under Kublai Khan conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty, they did not dismantle this quintessentially Chinese institution. As foreign conquerors, they had an even greater need for a centralized source of revenue that was independent of the local Chinese gentry. They enthusiastically adopted the salt monopoly, recognizing it as the perfect tool for extracting the wealth of the nation they now ruled. The native Chinese Ming dynasty, which overthrew the Mongols, continued the system, as did the Manchu Qing dynasty that followed them. For 2,000 years, the Salt Commission was a permanent fixture of the Chinese government, as essential and as unchanging as the emperor's own throne. It was the great, enduring cash cow of the imperial state. Its very permanence and profitability also made it a breeding ground for both administrative genius and spectacular corruption. The post of a high-ranking Salt official was a double-edged sword. It was a position where a brilliant and honest administrator could make a massive contribution to the stability and prosperity of the empire. But it was also a position. The system's longevity is a testament to its profound effectiveness. It was the great stabilizer. It provided the baseline of revenue that allowed the imperial state to function, to pay its core bureaucracy, and to fund its armies, even when other sources of income failed. But its endurance also reveals a deeper truth about the nature of power in China. The Salt Hegemony was the ultimate expression of the legalist worldview, the triumph of the state's interest over private enterprise in the most essential of commodities. Its 2,000-year history demonstrates that, in China, the control of strategic resources has always been seen as a fundamental and non-negotiable prerogative of the state. This principle, forged in the age of the Han emperors and refined through 60 generations, would outlast the emperors themselves. The monopoly was so deeply embedded in the political and economic structure of the nation that it would survive the fall of the last dynasty in 1911, continuing in a modified form under the Republic and even into the communist era. The Salt Hegemony was more than just a successful fiscal policy. It was a core component of China's political DNA, a 2,000-year-old testament to the enduring power of the bureaucratic state. The Salt Hegemony was a system of breathtaking longevity and undeniable effectiveness. For 2 millennia, it was the financial superpower that stood behind the Dragon Throne, the great, secret engine that funded the armies, built the canals, and paid the bureaucrats who held the vast and fractious Chinese empire together. Its success as a tool of statecraft is written in the unparalleled continuity of Chinese civilization. While other empires rose and fell, fragmenting into 1,000 pieces, China, again and again, managed to re-establish a unified, centralized, bureaucratic state. The salt monopoly was not the only reason for this remarkable resilience, but it was an indispensable one. It provided the administrative and financial backbone that made such a political structure possible. But this stability, this unity, this continuity came at a profound and often terrible price. The Salt Hegemony was not a benign institution. It was an instrument of authoritarian control, a source of immense popular misery, a catalyst for violent rebellion, and a potential brake on economic innovation. The final legacy of the salt monopoly is, therefore, a complex and deeply ambivalent one. It was both the great stabilizer and the great oppressor. The most immediate and obvious price was paid by the common people. The salt monopoly was, in its essence, a universal and regressive tax on life itself. By seizing control of a biological necessity and artificially inflating its price, the state was extracting revenue from every single household in the empire, and the burden fell most heavily on the poor. For a wealthy court official, the high price of salt was a minor annoyance. But for a peasant farmer with a tiny plot of land and a family to feed, it was a significant and crippling expense. It was a tax on their very ability to preserve their food, to survive the winter, and to keep their bodies healthy. The high price of legal salt was a constant source of simmering resentment, a daily reminder of the state's heavy and intrusive hand in the most basic aspects of their lives. When famines or floods struck and the price of grain skyrocketed, the added burden of the salt tax could be the final straw that pushed a desperate populace into banditry and open rebellion. It is no accident that so many of China's great peasant uprisings, from the Yellow Turbans to the Taiping Rebellion, found their most fervent support in regions where the salt administration was particularly corrupt or oppressive. The hegemony was a pillar of the state, but it was a pillar that rested on the bent backs of the peasantry. The second great price was the creation of a permanent, violent, and destabilizing shadow economy. The state's monopoly did not, and could not, eliminate the private trade in salt. It simply criminalized it. The immense profits to be made from smuggling guaranteed that there would always be those who were willing to defy the state's authority. This created a parallel world, a vast black market with its own armies, its own logistics, and its own brutal code of conduct. The perpetual war between the Salt Commission and the salt gangs was a massive and wasteful expenditure of national resources. It diverted tens of thousands of men into the unproductive work of policing and enforcement on one side, and into criminality and violence on the other. More dangerously, the great smuggling syndicates served as a permanent, alternative power structure, a ready-made military and logistical framework for any ambitious rebel leader. The story of Huang Chao, the salt smuggler, who became a rebel emperor and brought the great Tang dynasty to its knees, was the ultimate cautionary tale. The state, by creating the monopoly, had also inadvertently created its most dangerous and effective enemies. The Salt Hegemony was a system that bred its own antibodies. A third, more subtle but equally profound price was the stifling of private enterprise and economic innovation. The salt industry, by its very nature, should have been a source of immense private wealth and a driver of commercial growth. But by nationalizing this key sector of the economy, the state deliberately and systematically channeled all of that potential profit into its own coffers. It created a system where the greatest rewards went not to the innovative merchant or the efficient producer, but to the government official who managed the monopoly. This had a chilling effect on the development of a strong, independent merchant class, the very class that would, in Europe, become the engine of the capitalist and industrial revolutions. In China, the most ambitious and talented entrepreneurs were often drawn into the state bureaucracy rather than challenging it from the outside. While the Salt Hegemony was a brilliant solution for funding a pre-modern bureaucratic state, it may have, in the long run, hindered the development of the more dynamic, market-driven economy that would eventually allow the West to surpass China. The stability it provided came at the cost of dynamism. It was a system designed to preserve and sustain the existing order, not to create a new one. In the final analysis, the Salt Hegemony must be judged by the problem it was designed to solve. The great, existential challenge of Chinese political history was the struggle against fragmentation. The primary goal of every dynasty was to hold the vast, diverse, and geographically fractured territory of China together as a single unified state. Compared to the endless, bloody, and chaotic feudal warfare that defined so much of post-Roman European history, the Chinese model of a centralized, bureaucratic empire offered a different path, a path of greater stability, greater internal peace, and a more profound and enduring sense of shared civilization. This was the grand bargain. The salt monopoly was a key part of the price of that bargain. The Chinese people surrendered control over a vital commodity to the state, and in return, the state acquired the financial and administrative power to resist the centrifugal forces of feudalism and to hold the empire together. It was a brutal, oppressive, and often corrupt system. It inflicted immense hardship on the poor and created a permanent, violent underworld. But it worked. It provided the enduring backbone that allowed the Chinese imperial state to function, to survive, and to regenerate itself for 2,000 years. The grain of salt, when placed in the scales of history, is heavier than it appears. We have also explored the dark side of this hegemony, the immense burden it placed on the common people, and the violent shadow economy of salt smuggling that it inevitably created, a threat that could sometimes escalate into open rebellion. Yet, despite its oppressiveness, the salt hegemony endured for 2,000 years. It was the great stabilizer, the administrative and financial backbone that allowed China to consistently resist the forces of feudal fragmentation and maintain its unity. It was the price the Chinese people paid for a unified, bureaucratic empire, a system of power and control so effective that it became the defining feature of their civilization. The story of the Salt Hegemony is, in the end, a story about the fundamental nature of power. It is the ultimate case study in political economy, a 2,000-year-long demonstration of how a state can forge the control of a single essential resource into an instrument of immense and enduring authority. While other empires built their power on the fleeting fortunes of gold mines or the shifting loyalties of feudal lords, the Chinese imperial state anchored itself to a biological constant, the human body's non-negotiable need for salt. This was a foundation as solid and as permanent as the bedrock of the continent itself. The system was a masterpiece of cold, pragmatic, and legalist logic that gave the state a power its European counterparts could only dream of. The lessons of this ancient model resonate with surprising force in our modern world. The Salt Hegemony was, in essence, the world's first and most successful nationalized industry, the prototype for every state-owned enterprise to follow. The age-old debate between state control and private enterprise, between the Confucian ideal of a moral, non-interventionist government and the legalist demand for a powerful, revenue-driven state, is a debate that has never ended. The strategists of the Han court who designed the salt monopoly would have instantly understood the geopolitics of the 21st century. They would have recognized the power that state-controlled oil companies give to modern autocrats, and they would have seen their own logic reflected in the state's desire to control everything from telecommunications to the electrical grid. The fundamental question, who should control the essential resources of a nation, is the same now as it was then. The Salt Hegemony is also a stark lesson in the paradox of stability. The system was brilliantly designed to sustain, to endure, and to resist change. It provided the administrative and financial continuity that allowed Chinese civilization to weather the fall of dynasties and to rebuild itself, time and again, in the same bureaucratic mold. But this very resilience may have come at a cost. The system was so effective at funding the traditional, agrarian bureaucratic state that it may have, in the long run, disincentivized the kind of radical, market-driven innovation that eventually allowed the West to surge ahead. It was a system designed for permanence, not for revolution. It is a powerful reminder that the same institutions that provide a society with its greatest strengths can also, over time, become the source of its deepest vulnerabilities. Ultimately, the story of Salt forces us to look beyond the grand narratives of emperors, battles, and philosophies, and to see the hidden, often mundane, structures that truly govern a society. The real power that held the Chinese empire together was not just the mandate of heaven, but the meticulous work of the countless, nameless Salt officials in their remote provincial posts, the silent army of men of the brush, who audited the ledgers, inspected the shipments, and battled the smugglers. They were the true, enduring rulers of China. The Great Wall is a monument to the empire's ambition, but the Salt Hegemony was the invisible scaffolding that allowed it to be built and rebuilt for 2,000 years.